by the parties, 3 representatives on the policing board, Joanne Bunting, Maurice Bradley and Trevor Clark. And also we're glad to welcome to the stage Johnny Byrne, academic expert in policing, and Chief Superintendent Stephen Murray from the PSNI. So you're all very welcome. Maybe Joanne, I'll start with you, furthest away. Can you just give me a sort of an inside sense of what it was like to be there on the policing board as the sort of double crisis unfolded? There must have been times when you must have had to pinch yourself both about the data breach and then about what then happened in relation to the court case.
It was a lot, Mark. I think some of us feel like we live there at the minute. Look, the PSNI was in crisis, and we're in the business of trying to instill confidence in the PSNI. We want our communities to support the police. So one thing after another was a very difficult period. It was also massively exacerbated by people who, from the outsides, decided that they knew more than we did, despite the fact that they were not privy to the information that we had, nor to the legal advice that we had, and the restrictions that we had in terms of the actions we could do. So it was a very difficult period. It was a very difficult period for the officers, actually, some of whom are at huge risk in terms of the work that they do. But hopefully now, the bulk of that is under control. Every officer has been triaged in terms of their risk, and hopefully now we're coming towards the light and out of the darkness.
Trevor Clark, I mean, there has been some criticism of the policing board throughout all of this. Some people saying, why was Simon Byrne given a contract when that court case was still hanging over his head? And then some criticism from some influential figures about the mess that was left in the immediate aftermath of his resignation before you got the interim chief constable appointed. What's your response to all of that?
Well, I suppose in the first instance, the contract come at a time there was no outcome in relation to the court case. We had to allow, obviously, that opportunity to pan out. The DUP were very quick whenever the outcome in the case came that Simon's position was untenable. And in terms of the other part, I think Joanne has touched on that. There was people who had criticism of the board and how they handled things. It's no secret that those who had been in the inside, the DUP's position was very clear that we needed someone to step up in the interim to fill that vacuum that was being caused by, obviously, the quick departure of the then Chief Constable. But unfortunately, legal advice that we've been receiving prevented us from doing so. And it was only just last week, whenever the Secretary of State made those changes, that we were able to move that forward.
Now, you have John Boucher in place. Are you confident that he's going to be the person to address this kind of crisis of confidence in policing that we have right now?
Well, I mean, there was an open process in terms of candidates putting their names forward. There was a number of candidates put their names into that pool. There was advice taken from HMIC and the HR in terms of who was the most suitable candidate, and John Boucher has been appointed. Am I confident that John can deliver? I think time will tell. We have to give him a fair wind. He's in post now. He has come in with a lot of experience from other forces. So hopefully, and I say respectfully, hopefully he can deliver on what we need to turn this around for policing.
Maurice Bradley, how would you sum up the general mood within unionism and confidence in policing now in the wake of both the data breach and then, of course, the revelations in the court case, or the allegations in the court case in relation to Sinn Féin supposedly having a perceived threat to withdraw from policing, something which, of course, they've denied?
Well, Mark, I think confidence within the community is pretty low in the PSNI at the moment, and that is something that they have to address in the days coming forward. A lack of confidence in the senior management team, even within the PSNI themselves, has manifested itself. I don't think that going forward that they can afford to lose any more confidence in policing from our community. And the two-tier policing, which has been an allegation which has been bandied about.
What do you mean by two-tier policing?
Well, there is an allegation that the PSNI treat one section of the community more favourably than the other. That's a perception that has to be addressed, and it's something that will build up confidence within the unionist community.
Chief Superintendent Murray, realise you're in the hot seat here, so let's be kind to him. We've seen reports of individual members of staff, for instance, one telling Spotlight just the other day that morale is at rock bottom now in the PSNI. Is that a perception that you would agree with, and how do you go about addressing it?
Yeah, well, Mark, thank you. Morale in policing ebbs and flows as time goes on. There's no doubt we're in a very difficult period. It's been acknowledged by our current Chief Constable and also our previous Chief Constable. For me as a local leader, I need to address that by being visible. And we talk about care, listen and act. For me, that's about care and listen and act internally to my officers and staff and doing what I can to address that. The real challenge for us is how that addressing morale meets our budgetary challenges going forward. So, for example, when we speak to our staff and officers, they talk about the 7% pay raise that our colleagues in England have enjoyed and not having that, which gives us some difficulties around managing morale. And there's some issues around just our terms and conditions in general, which is outside the gift of our senior executive team to deliver, and we probably need to do some work around that.
Because obviously there's going to be a massive financial implication to the data breach. We've still yet to really get a figure in how it will work its way through. How do you think the PSNI will be able to cope with that? Will it require the Treasury to come in and back you up, given you don't have that many resources right now?
So my understanding is there is an ask for additional support around that. Unfortunately, I'm not in that. Maybe colleagues on the board will be able to answer that more than I will, but I'm not in the service executive team. What I understand is there's an ask for some additional funding to support that work around the data breach.
Johnny Byrne, how would you sum up the challenges that are now facing John Boucher, given what he's inherited?
Thanks, Mark. I think there's a couple of things. First of all, he's interim, so the closing date for the full-time post is on Monday, but you know, a lot of people are assuming that he's there and he may be there for the long term if he's a successful candidate. So as an interim Chief Constable, I think there's very little he can do in terms of changing some of those big cultural issues internally and externally. Technically, he might only be there for a few weeks. In the long term, I think there's issues around, you know, budgets in terms of recruitment, in terms of potential fines coming down the road, in terms of promoting neighbourhood policing. Externally, there's the issue around building confidence at a local level with the community. But I think there's another question here around, and I think the board are integral to this, is in terms of what do we want the police for? What do we actually need the police for? Is it essentially about 999, blue light, answering calls, or do we want the police to be an integral part of our community, working with us in partnership, problem solving? And unfortunately, given the resources, you can't have both right now.
And there has been a question about John Boucher's appointment, even in the interim, that he's also obviously the senior officer who headed up Operation Canova. Do you see that as a problem?
From the press conference and from the board obviously appointing him, I don't think technically it's a problem. I think the fact that we're talking about it is an issue. I think the fact that people are associating him with the past and with legacy issues may prove difficult if he has to constantly explain those things. But on the upside, it does give him a unique understanding of some of the complexities that exist here in this part of the country.
I assume because you were party to signing off on that interim appointment that you didn't necessarily see the fact that John Boucher was heading up Operation Canova, which is going to report soon, as a problem. You think it's something that he can get around and that the force could get around?
I'm glad you assumed that we didn't see that as an issue, Mark, because some of us did actually see that as an issue, and that concern was expressed. But a significant piece of work's been done in the background. There's assurances now that whilst he is the author of the report and he's the interim Chief Constable, if there's criticisms in that report, I think it will be someone else within the senior management team will be out front and centre speaking to that report as opposed to John Boucher. And I think that's seen as one of the ways to get around that issue. But ultimately, you can't prevent an individual who is a high-ranking officer applying for a post based on some legacy work that he's been involved in. And for that reason, that we wish John the best in terms of bringing forward his recommendations in the short term, bringing forward the report, and if he applies for the substantive role, then he's entitled to do so as well.
Joanne Bunting, when this all sort of shakes down, is there kind of room for a kind of wider inquiry about how the policing board has handled all of this? Because obviously there have been criticisms not only of its actions within the last few days, but also its actions at the time of the Ormer Road incident and the arrest and de-arrest and so on of the person from the Ormer Road bookies group.
I think there's no doubt, Mark. You know, there was reference in the judgment to specific actions taken that certainly some of us on the board were not aware of at the time and considered to be something of an overreach on the board's behalf. But the board has now agreed that there will be an independent review of those relationships and how the board interacts. And hopefully then that will see us back on the right track. It's important. I mean, we have a dual role, as you'll appreciate, which is one of advocacy for the police, but also one of scrutiny of the police. And it's a difficult balance to strike, but it's important that we do it the right way, and it's important that the boundaries are respected, because everything operational is within the Chief Constable's gift. And so it is not for the board to step into that space. And that's why it's really important in those circumstances that whenever we all have the right to lobby the Chief Constables and to lobby police officers and to ask them for things and to ask them to take action. And sometimes they can, but it's important that they push back. And that's where this became a problem. It's perfectly fine for Sinn Féin and for us and for anybody else who wishes to have a conversation with the senior executive team about how they're conducting an issue. But the problem is, if it's not our space, the police need to say, no, this is operational. It's not your business. We will take on board your concerns. We will evaluate. But they need to push back, and they should have pushed back in these circumstances, to my mind.
Chief Superintendent Murray, in the immediate aftermath of the data breach, there was a lot of talk that people were going to start walking away from the PSNI, from their jobs, or from whether they were in the civilian staff or in the police service. Have you seen any evidence of that?
It's a bit of a mixed bag around how people reacted. Obviously, data breach was significant. It fundamentally influenced people's morale in policing. It was a significant event for so many officers and staff who hid their career from even their neighbours, and all of a sudden they were in the public domain. As a police service, then we had to address some of those risks and ran a threat management process on every single officer who felt they were at risk, and then put mitigation in to support that officer or the staff member around actually feeling secure in their house, and so they didn't have to take that appalling step of having to leave the job. So I think as a police service we worked really, really quickly to step up mechanisms to actually stop that from happening. Will officers and staff leave? Potentially. It is a significant incident. However, we are doing everything we possibly can to support officers and staff at this time.
Trevor Clark, because there was a perception that in particular Catholic officers might feel increasingly vulnerable after their details were made public as a result of the data breach, that it might hit the numbers of Catholic officers serving within the PSNI, and that there have been calls from some nationalist politicians for a return to the 50-50 recruitment policy. What would you make of that?
Well, I think it was opportunistic in terms of some of those politicians to make that call. The numbers don't indicate that nationalists want to join the police in the numbers that some wish, and that's because the nationalist politicians and other community leaders don't actually support those within those communities to take those roles. So I think if the nationalist politicians would come out and be clear in terms of their support for policing unequivocal, and that those officers would get their support and protection within the communities, that would have happened anyhow. In terms of the data breach, I'm not sure that there's any difference between someone from a nationalist community or a unionist community in terms of that fear. I think the fear was equal right across the board. And maybe picking up on a question that you had asked Stephen, the evidence at the moment is very clear that the numbers are very small in terms of those who's made that decisive decision to leave the force, and it's less than 10.
Less than 10. Oh, that's interesting to know. Johnny Byrne, how realistic do you think this talk about a return to 50-50 recruitment is?
I think it's more soundbite, and it's a response to a problem. Personally, I'm not a fan or a supporter of it. I think it's a lazy policy. Now, I think there was a need in terms of jump-starting recruitment within the Catholic Nationalist Republican community into the PSNI, but I think it served its purpose in those first 10 years. But I actually think, and as somebody who comes from that background, that there was a trick missed in terms of embedding policing within nationalist communities as a normal occupation and a normal form of employment. So I think that 50-50 only works if wider communities buy into it and actually support it. But also, in terms of the unionist community, I don't actually think it helps the language and the narrative around two-tier policing either, because I think that in itself will alienate unionist people who want to join the police as well. So I think that it works on both sides in terms of, and I just think we have to be very careful about how we talk about policing.
Maurice Bradley, you mentioned two-tier policing earlier on, and of course in relation to the Ormer Road incident, people felt that the two-tier was working the other way, because there'd been a previous incident with loyalists when police had stood off, and then they felt that instead the police had moved in on the group of relatives at the commemoration event on the Ormer Road. So I suppose what I'm getting at is, What is the perception right now on the street of officers of the neighbour police teams and local police teams? Has it been affected by this high-level controversy?
I think our neighbourhood policing teams are the most valuable asset we have in policing today, and they've been pulled apart by the current situation within the PSNI itself. There's officers been taken from neighbourhood policing and repositioned all over the place to cover up where there are deficiencies. So it's a major problem, and the perception around the Ormer Road was that the Chief Constable acted too quickly, too hastily, and made the wrong decisions based on the wrong evidence. That has been borne out by the recent court case. So the PSNI have a massive job of rebuilding confidence within the Unionist community. You spoke about 50-50 policing. Policing should be about getting the best person for the job at the time, not about what background or race, anything. It should be about employing the best people for the best outcome.
Joanne Bunting, obviously getting Sinn Féin to fully buy into policing was part of the whole deal back in 2006, 2007 when the DUP returned to power sharing. Now, we've seen this court case in which there's been the assertion from the judge that the police officers, senior police officers reacted to a perceived sense that Sinn Féin may pull away from policing. Sinn Féin has categorically denied that. Jerry Kelly said, look, I never made any such threat. So you're having to work with them on a daily basis on the policing board. Are you giving them the benefit of the doubt?
No. No. Look, Sinn Féin says what it says, but I think we're all very familiar with how Sinn Féin speaks out of both sides of its mouth, Mark, and it's not a massive leap from what was in Anne Foblacht to the Chief Constable reaching his conclusion. That said, the action that he took is on him. Now, I do want to give credit to Simon Byrne in that for a long time, the issues around the confidence of the Unionist community in policing were dismissed. No, that's not an issue. And we all knew it was a massively significant issue in our communities. And it was a significant change for our community to feel like that about the police. So at least Simon, and I will give him credit for this, Simon was the first Chief Constable to acknowledge, yes, there was an issue of confidence in our community and it needed to be addressed. And he was the one who instigated, there's been a series of these they're called real engagement events with kind of these affected groups. And I just want to come back on, you asked Trevor a question about the Catholic community and Catholic recruits. Let's not forget, the position hasn't changed for them in terms of risk. So we have to bear in mind that whenever those people from those backgrounds want to join the police, very often they have to move away from their family. They can't go and visit their brothers and sisters. They can't go and visit their parents because of the areas in which they live. Now, that's not on the police to fix. I think the police have bent over backwards and done as much as they can do to try and recruit from the Catholic community. But they need political leadership to say, no, it is safe and it is fine and this is a viable career for you. And actually, I think there's an equal problem just within working class communities in general about how they feel about the police. And certainly in our community, there is a feeling that they don't deal, well, certainly this is my view, that they don't necessarily all the time when they're conducting an operation deal with the situation. They assess the community and then determine how they will deal with the issue. And that is where the problem arises.
What do you mean by that? Can you spell that out more?
In terms of an operational assessment, I think that they weigh up, okay, what's the biggest threat here, who's the biggest risk, and then they act accordingly against the people who are the least risk. And we've seen that with parades and protests and so on. And that, you see, this is not a recent problem. This has been building and building and building and building. So thankfully now, the PSNI recognise that there are issues of confidence within working class communities, within the CNR community and within our community. And hopefully now, even under John Boucher's tenure, they will continue to address this because it can't be left by the wayside. It is imperative that the community supports the police and the police can police with the community.
Chief Superintendent Murray, do you have anything to say to that sort of perception of police working on the basis of what's the biggest risk here, what's the biggest threat?
So perception is perception. It's very hard for me to change that here on the stage. What I will say as someone who leads in local policing and runs districts and areas, we do consider community impact. However, we consider that in a fair and consistent approach along for how we make decisions. I absolutely get that policing is challenging, and we are there to uphold the law, and that can bring two different communities, can drift them apart or bring them together, but we're the ones that are apolitical in the middle of it and have to make those really difficult decisions. So the perception is there. I get that. I felt it as a district commander when people stopped speaking to me the next day after speaking to me for 5 years, just because something was done at a different level of policing. So for me, it's about getting back to basics of policing as a local, and arresting the drink drivers, dealing with domestic incidents, and showing really good policing at the local level, and how that translates then upwards and encourages people to join policing, because policing is a really good career and people want to do it, and people can make a difference because they can arrest bad guys and keep good guys safe.
Trevor Clark revealed there that maybe only 10 officers or civilian staff have left in total, but of course the PSNI is below complement. How important do you think it is that it's actually brought up to the complement?
Well, New Decade, New Approach indicated there should be 7,500 officers at this stage. There's evidence to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee that we're going to go to around 6,300, I believe, in the next couple of years. That's fundamentally going to change how policing looks and feels. And particularly if we're looking at some of those where we're moving resource, some of the like to do is neighbourhood policing. I'm not saying that's, but if we're being really honest around it, if I need to sustain a district, it's the 999 calls, emergency calls that where the public need us the most. That is where I'm going to focus my resource. That's not to say the neighbourhood function is not vital in Northern Ireland. It absolutely is. But you need the money and you need the resource to be able to fund that. And that's really difficult decisions that our set team and the board are making around this.
That in itself plays into the morale issues, because people are being asked to do much more with much less, and that leads to stress and all the issues, and people go off and all more pressure. So.
Trevor Clark, when we talk about possible negotiations with the government, it's all about the Windsor Framework and Brexit and the Northern Ireland Protocol, but one would assume that some kind of financial package would also be part of any return to Stormont. To what extent are you and your colleagues here on the policing board pushing for funding for policing to be part of any package on restoration and devolution?
Well, I mean, setting aside the devolution issue, I mean, the party leader and ourselves has made the issue a priority long before we've got to the stage we're at now. We have to remember this, and I mean, actually, Stephen referenced it, the New Decade, New Approach. It was the two governments indicated the number of 7,500. So if the Secretary of State would forget about his niche projects like Casement Park and funding and promising additional funding for that, and actually come with a funding package now for policing, which delivers for all of the community as opposed to one community over the other, I think those things would work.
Is the funding package you're looking for not just in terms of meeting the New Decade New Approach promises, but also in terms of maybe funding these extra resource requirements that there are now going to be in terms of compensation after the data breach and so on, which appear to be quite massive?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's a figure in terms of the data breach yet, and I would assume, given some of the language coming from Westminster, that there will be support for that. I mean, I think it's unprecedented. It's not something that you can budget for. So I would hope they'll live to that commitment released to that. I mean, let's not say that Northern Ireland's a place apart. There has been data breaches in 3 forces, I think, at this point across the rest of the UK. So we're not unique, except our circumstances are different because of the security implications. So we're still part of the UK, and I believe that there's a consequence of that the British government should assist and have made some commitments in terms of that data breach.
Almost out of time. Johnny Byrne, I'll maybe give you a sort of final roundup thought. What will be the main challenges you now think facing the new interim Chief Constable?
I think if you look back at previous Chief Constables, from Sir Ronnie Flanagan, there was Oma Heward, HET, Matt Baggett, Flags, George Hamilton, Loughlin Island, the Dry Your Eyes comment, Simon Byrne, Ormer Road. We never really get to the point where we just talk about performance and effectiveness in terms of, are you keeping people safe? And I think, to me, that's where I would like to shift the agenda.
On that note, we have to leave it. So Joanne Bunting, Johnny Byrne, Maurice Bradley, Stephen Matthews, and Trevor Clark, thank you very much.